I'm not going to use a PowerPoint, so I did intend to do that, but then I decided there's been such interesting things being said that I didn't want to restrict it to the PowerPoint, so to go. I was asked actually about a month ago by Mariana if I could just talk very briefly about this notion in the adult learning and development literature of the subject-object and how that plays out. And how that connects into actually all of the stories and the experiences that you've been hearing about today. And actually the subject-object is basically one saying, taking what is subject, meaning it's embedded in us, we're not aware of it in any way, shape, or form, but it's impacting on our way that we act, the way we respond to certain kinds of situations. And either because of some kind of experiences, some kind of practices, some kind of events that take place, suddenly we start to gradually become aware of that, and it becomes object in the sense that we can hold it out and be able to reflect on it, to think about it, and inquire into it. So, for example, the subject-object split is very generic to the work of constructive developmental theory. That would include Bill Torbert's work, which was just being referred to in a way when you're talking about the achiever and those different action logics. Also, it is embedded in Bob Kegan's work, where he has a very parallel kind of theory. The two have collaborated over time, say, going from either the socialized self to being the self-authorizing self, self-authoring, and then even to a different kind of mindset. So just as illustration, when you're the socialized self, what is subject to you are your needs, what you're really looking for. What's objective is what your impulses are, because it's a process of having passed from being an impulsive person, which I still am, but most people get over that when they're teenagers. Then they start to be able to be very much aware of, okay, I have this impulse, what have you. But the fact that I need approval from people who I respect, the fact that I need to fit into this great environment that I have, I'm very interested in making sure that I am accepted by the larger academic community. All of that is really subject in terms of how that actually affects my behavior and so forth. But gradually over time, that starts to become objective. I start to be aware of the fact that what I have are different relationships and different ways of relating to people, mutual and so forth. And what is more subjective at that point in time is still how my identity is influencing me. So in short, this is an ongoing kind of process of continual awareness, ongoing development. The same kind of process is involved with what's actually a former professor of mine and then later colleague, Jack Mesereau, in his theory of transformative learning. Jack was arguing that the way we respond to the events in our lives are through our meaning perspective, through the frame of reference that we have. And when we experience events, many times our underlying assumptions, our underlying, the way we've been embedded with sort of the mindsets that many of the previous speakers talked about, we're not aware of that. We're not really aware of how those assumptions come into play. That relates to the question that somebody asked earlier about whites thinking, you know what, I'm not really racist. I'm not really aware of that. And what actually popped into my mind was going back to a story that influenced me. One of my early mentors back in my corporate days was the first African-American officer at the Traveler Insurance Company, Norm Edmonds. And we were doing organizational change kind of work and so forth, and we had a very small, tight team, whatever. Quick story. One day we were down in Philadelphia, working in the Philadelphia office. We were doing a workshop there, whatever. Philly is where I grew up. I grew up in the Kensington section of Philadelphia, and I was still only like 26 years old, and I'm back in the old, neighborhood. While I have these groups working, Norm comes into the room and he says to me, "Hey, Lyle, there's a black bar down the street. We can go there after work." Without even thinking, reflexive, I said, "Norm, what the hell are you trying to do? Get me killed?" Just what made Norm such a great mentor was he didn't yell. He didn't say, "What the hell would you say that?" And he used to do this repeatedly. He would say, "Lyle, what makes you say that? I don't think you're trying to get me killed when we go to a white bar. I can't tell you." That was And it's a situation that I think of to this day. It was bringing, to use the academic word, something that was subject, object. And then as you continue to reflect on it, you continue to think about what that is and how unaware we are. What are the implications of these things from an adult education standpoint? In addressing many of the challenges of going from A/B to A equals B is dealing with the paradox of diversity, to use some of the stuff we're working with. What do we mean by paradox of diversity? Diverse groups have the potential for very significant learning. However, it's very hard to really extract that learning, particularly when you're talking about topics that carry high emotional valence. Because what starts to happen is we automatically fall back into our comfort zone, our defensive routines and so forth, or we may choose not to say that, but in a left-hand column we're thinking, here's where we're going again, here's where all this is happening. So the challenge becomes one of being able to get people to listen to the experience of the other. The problem with the paradox of diversity is that we don't really know the experience of the other. We haven't experienced it. We may have read about it, we may have heard it in these kinds of talks, but we haven't lived it. It's not embedded in us. And how do we create what we would call some kind of affective empathy, where we go from the emotion that is separating us to more of a sense of felt insight into what the experience of the other is. That involves not so much rational discourse as listening to the stories, sharing stories, the use of expressive ways of knowing. There was some elements of that in Christopher's talk earlier today, where he was also talking about his experiences and how they were playing out, and the ability to be able to really listen to that. And you don't really have the experience of the other. For example, there's no way that I could ever fully understand Norm's experiences growing up. There's just no way. But through stories and through the kind of sharings that we had and so forth, I could start to gain some insight, just to go back to that stage of time and realize, yes, I would say, no, I don't have any racial kinds of assumptions there. I worked at Meharry Medical School. Here's my students. Here's this, here's that. No. You start to become a felt awareness. There's a range of different ways that you can approach this, I think. One is through the use of expressive ways of knowing and really hearing the stories of others and then sharing those stories, and that takes time. It's not something that can be done in a 10-minute kind of thing or even a one-day kind of workshop. Meditation also involves in that, and there's different forms of meditation. But one of the other themes that I hear going through the course of the day is, and again I'm going back into one of the theoretical frameworks that I'm most familiar with, is the difference between, in the affective, is the difference between emotion, which tends to be separating. When I'm mad at you, or I'm even really in love with you and it's more about me than it is you, that's a separating kind of thing. Feeling on the participatory side is a sense of having some felt experience of the other. And that's one way coming through that is through hearing stories. It's through how do we get a sense of what the other's experience is. That requires what I would call holistic dialogue, becoming very much mindful of how you are taking what is known and putting it into more cognitive kind of awareness. But cognitive kind of awareness is always exclusionary. It doesn't, the more we use theories, we're leaving stuff out. True experiential is being fully integrated. And what's really becoming interesting to me at this point in time is how this impacts insight meditation, which is one form of several different forms of meditation. In some interviews and some comments that I've had from people that I've known, and I'm now starting to want to actually interview this, one person shared who'd been practicing now for well over a year or whatever, much more than that actually, more like 5-6 years, was engaged in a meditation that had nothing to do with the story that I was about to say, but she was living through a period of time where there were two folks in the family that were having a lot of conflict, and there was one person who she felt was abusing the other and was very angry at that person, very, very angry at that person. But she was just sort of meditating and not about that. All of a sudden, in the middle of the process, this felt internal experience started to come up, where it came up as sort of the vision of sort of water, and being deep on the top of water was initially this sort of feeling of this is where the anger is, whatever. But as her intrinsic vision went down, what she started to see deeper down the bottom was how this person who she was so angry with was really feeling very insecure, very sad, very much, it was a very uncomfortable kind of way, and it changed the whole way she then viewed this individual. And that's an example, I think, and I'll just give that one because I know we have time constraints here, of the fact that that's not just using expressive ways of knowing to get insight, but it's having the internal systemic experience of the other. Now, how that works, I don't pretend to know, but I think it does have a relationship to saying everybody is interconnected. There's always this inner system that's being shared, and the need to explore ways that allow us to effectively connect with the energy of the other. So I think at the heart of both what Mariana has been talking about, insight, meditation, whether you take the more approaches of constructive developmental theory, it's always about looking for methods that allow one to become more aware of their consciousness and becoming more conscious of what they're feeling and trying to understand and be conscious of the other. And then it's when those two sets of energy systems start to intertwine that you start to really build, I would argue, a sense of connectedness and the possibility of dealing with the kind of challenges that we have right now. Even going back to some of the kinds of examples that were originally provided, when you talk about the issues that we're facing as a society right now, be it the Christians and the Muslims and how you bring those together and how that really comes together, what's really the reaction that's actually happening now, the police versus the African American community. Being able to get that kind of dialogue going is not an easy thing to do, but it can't be done just through verbal exchange. I think it needs to be done through some kind of felt systemic connection. And there are various ways of really looking at that, and that's where the arts, that's where presentational knowing, that gets people to start to think much more seriously about how their own experiences are shaping the way in which they are perceiving the world at this point in time. And I think my time is up. Is that right? This is very hard for a professor to have a time limit, you understand. So I'll be happy to turn it over.
Well, you're now a part of a conversation. So we get to, yes, thank you very much.